The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1882, and Zachary Yates stood on the platform of the San Diego train station with his heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. He had sent his photograph and letters to the matrimonial agency 6 months ago, never really believing a woman would agree to travel all the way from Pennsylvania to marry a man she had never met. But here he was, hat in hand, watching the steam engine pull into the station with a screech of brakes that set his teeth on edge. The California sun beat down on his shoulders, and sweat trickled down his spine beneath his best shirt, the one he had pressed himself that morning with shaking hands because he wanted to make a good impression, wanted this woman to look at him and think maybe she had made the right choice after all. The passengers began to disembark, and Zachary scanned each face with growing anxiety. An elderly couple, a businessman with a leather satchel, 2 young boys chasing each other down the platform. Then he saw her. She was smaller than he had imagined, with dark hair tucked beneath a simple bonnet and a worn brown traveling dress that had seen better days. She clutched a single carpetbag in both hands and stood on the platform looking around with wide eyes that held equal parts hope and terror. Their eyes met across the crowded station, and Zachary knew. This was Natalie Owens, his mail-order bride. He walked toward her, and she watched him approach with her fingers tightening on the handle of her bag. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face from the long journey, the dust on her skirts, and the way her lips pressed together as though she was preparing herself for something difficult. She was pretty in a quiet way, with soft features and eyes the color of maple syrup. "Miss Owens?" he asked, removing his hat. "I'm Zachary Yates." She opened her mouth to respond, and nothing came out. Her face flushed pink, and she tried again. Mr. Y.Y. Yates." The words fought their way out between lips that seemed determined not to let them pass. Her face grew redder with each syllable, and Zachary saw shame flood her eyes. I'm sorry. ISHSH should have told you in the L letters." Understanding washed over him like cool water. She had a stutter, and she had been terrified to tell him. He thought about all her letters, carefully written in neat script, and realized she must have spent hours crafting each one to hide this truth she thought might make him reject her. His heart, which had been nervous before, now softened completely. "Take your time," he said gently, offering her a smile. "I love hearing your voice always." Her eyes widened in surprise, and tears welled up that she quickly blinked away. She took a shaky breath. Thank you." "That bag looks heavy," Zachary said, reaching for it. "My wagon is just over here." "I figured we could get you settled at the boarding house, and then maybe have some supper if you are not too tired from traveling. No rush on anything. We can take all the time you need to get to know each other proper before we make any permanent decisions." Natalie nodded, relief visible in every line of her body. She followed him to the wagon, and he helped her up onto the seat before climbing up beside her. The town of San Diego spread out around them, still rough around the edges but growing. Buildings lined the streets in various states of completion, and the harbor glittered in the distance where ships came and went with cargo. It was nothing like Pennsylvania, Zachary imagined. "It's beautiful," Natalie said, looking around with wonder. Very different." "That it is," Zachary agreed, guiding the horses through the street. "I came out here 5 years ago with nothing but a dream and a borrowed stake, bought some land north of town, built a ranch. Got about 200 head of cattle now and a dozen horses. It is not fancy, but it is honest work, and the land is good." He talked easily as they rode, not requiring responses from her, just letting her listen and absorb. He told her about the ranch, about his small house that needed a woman's touch, about the neighboring ranchers who were decent folk for the most part. He told her about the mild winters here compared to the harsh cold of the East, about the ocean that was close enough to visit on Sunday afternoons. Natalie listened intently, occasionally nodding or offering a soft smile. When they reached the boarding house, a tidy establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, Zachary helped her down and carried her bag inside. Mrs. Chen greeted them warmly. A Chinese woman who had come to California during the gold rush and stayed after her husband died in the mines. She had built a reputation for running the cleanest, most respectable boarding house in San Diego, and Zachary had specifically chosen it for Natalie. "Welcome, welcome," Mrs. Chen said, ushering Natalie inside. "Mr. Yates arranged everything. You have the room upstairs, very nice, very clean. I bring you hot water for washing, yes. Thank you," Natalie managed, and Mrs. Chen showed no reaction to the stutter, simply smiled and led her upstairs. Zachary waited in the parlor, turning his hat in his hands. When Natalie came back down 30 minutes later, she had washed the dust from her face and changed into a clean dress of dark blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was still damp at the temples. "Feeling better?" he asked. She nodded. "Why, yes, much be better." They walked to the restaurant together, a small place that served decent food and had tables far enough apart for private conversation. Zachary ordered for both of them when he saw Natalie's anxiety about speaking to the waiter, and she shot him a grateful look. "Tell me about Pennsylvania," he said when the waiter had gone. "Your letters mentioned you grew up on a farm." "My father had a dairy farm," Natalie said slowly, taking her time with each word. Zachary waited patiently, his eyes on her face, genuinely interested. "He died 2 years ago. The B bank took the L land. My mother passed when I was 10. "I am sorry," Zachary said. "That must have been hard," she nodded. "I went to L live with my aunt. She was kind, but she had F5 children of her own, and not enough money." "So you decided to come west," Zachary said. "I wanted a fresh start," Natalie said. Somewhere and no one knew me, where I could be useful." "You are very brave," Zachary told her. "Traveling all that way alone to meet a stranger, that takes real courage." Her cheeks flushed pink, but she smiled. The food arrived and they ate together in comfortable silence. Zachary noticed how Natalie had good manners despite her humble background, how she ate carefully and thanked the waiter when he refilled their water. There was a natural grace to her movements that spoke of a gentle spirit. After supper, Zachary walked her back to the boarding house as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They stood on the porch, and Natalie looked up at him with those soft eyes. "Thank you for being so kind," she said. "Most people lose patience." "I mean what I said," Zachary replied. "I do love hearing your voice. It tells me you are thinking carefully about your words, choosing them with intention. That is a rare quality." Tears shimmered in her eyes again, but this time she smiled through them. "I will see you tomorrow. I will come by after breakfast if that suits you," Zachary said. "Maybe I can show you around town properly." She nodded eagerly, and Zachary tipped his hat before heading back to his wagon. As he drove back to his ranch under the emerging stars, he found himself smiling. Natalie Owens was not what he had expected, but she was something better, something real. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Zachary rode into town with his heart lighter than it had been in months. He found Natalie waiting on the porch of the boarding house, dressed in the same blue dress with a shawl around her shoulders. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine expression that lit up her whole face. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he replied, offering his arm. "Are you ready for a tour?" They walked through San Diego together, and Zachary showed her everything. The general store where she could buy fabric and supplies. The church where services were held every Sunday. The small schoolhouse where children learned their letters. The harbor where fishing boats came in with their daily catch. Natalie took it all in with wide eyes, occasionally asking questions that came out haltingly, but were always intelligent and thoughtful. At the general store, Zachary insisted on buying her a new pair of gloves when he noticed how worn hers were. She protested, but he was firm. "Consider it a courting gift," he said with a grin. "A man is allowed to buy his intended something nice." She blushed but accepted them gratefully. They were simple brown leather gloves, practical but well made, and she held them like they were precious jewels. As they walked, people greeted Zachary with friendly waves and curious looks at Natalie. He introduced her as his mail-order bride, and most folks were welcoming. A few women even stopped to chat, and Zachary noticed how Natalie relaxed more with each positive interaction. "They seemin' nice," she said as they continued on. "Most folks here are good people," Zachary said. "Everyone came from somewhere else, looking for a better life." That creates a certain understanding. They had lunch at a small cafe, and afterward, Zachary took her to see the ocean. Natalie had never seen the Pacific before, and she stood on the beach with the wind whipping her skirts around her legs, staring at the vast expanse of water with awe written across her face. "It goes on forever," she breathed. "All the way to China," Zachary agreed. "Beautiful, is it not?" They walked along the shore, and Zachary told her stories about the ranch, about the cattle and horses, about the hands he employed and the work that needed doing. Natalie listened, and slowly she began to tell him more about herself, how she loved reading but had never owned many books, how she could sew and cook and tend a garden, how she had always dreamed of having her own home, her own family. "I want children," she said softly, "a house full of laughter." "That sounds perfect," Zachary said. "I always wanted a family myself." A man can only ranch alone for so long before he realizes he is missing something important. They stood watching the waves roll in, and Zachary felt something shift inside him. This was right. Natalie was right. He had known it from the moment he saw her on that platform, but now he was certain. Over the next 2 weeks, Zachary came to town every day. Sometimes they walked, sometimes they sat in the boarding house parlor and talked, sometimes they attended church services or community gatherings. He was patient with her speech, never rushing her, always waiting for her to finish her thoughts. And slowly, Natalie began to stutter less around him. Not because the stutter went away, but because she was no longer anxious about it. She knew he would wait, would listen, would value what she had to say. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing at the boarding house watching the sunset, Natalie turned to him with a serious expression. "Zachary," she said, his name coming out smoothly. "I think we should get him married." He looked at her in surprise. "You are sure?" She nodded. "I am sure." "Why you are a good man, kind and patient. I want to be your wife." Zachary took her hand, so small in his rough, calloused palm. "Then I would be honored if you would marry me, Natalie Owens. Truly honored." They were married 3 days later in the small church with Mrs. Chen and a few of the townspeople as witnesses. Natalie wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Zachary wore his best suit. When the preacher asked if he took this woman to be his wife, Zachary said yes with his whole heart. When Natalie was asked the same, she took a deep breath and said, "I do," without hesitation. Zachary kissed her gently when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Natalie's cheeks flushed pink, but she smiled up at him with such happiness that his heart felt like it might burst. They rode out to the ranch that afternoon with Natalie's few possessions loaded in the wagon. The ranch house came into view as they crested a hill, a modest structure of wood and stone with a covered porch and a sturdy roof. Smoke curled from the chimney where Zachary had left the fire burning that morning. Behind the house stood a barn, corrals for the horses, and pastures that stretched toward the hills. "It is beautiful," Natalie said, and Zachary could hear the emotion in her voice. "It is home," he said simply. "Our home now." He helped her down from the wagon and carried her across the threshold as tradition dictated. The interior was sparse, furnished with handmade furniture and lacking the touches that made a house a home, but Natalie looked around with shining eyes. "I see can make see curtains," she said, "and Q quilts, and we see could P plant a G garden in the SB spring." "Whatever you want," Zachary said. "This is your house now, too." That night they shared their first meal together in their home, a simple supper of stew and bread that Zachary had prepared. Natalie insisted on cleaning up afterward, shooing him away when he tried to help. He sat in the chair by the fire and watched her move around the kitchen, humming softly to herself, and thought about how empty this house had felt before she arrived. When it came time for bed, they were both nervous. Zachary showed Natalie to the bedroom, freshly cleaned with new sheets he had bought in town. "I want to be a G good wife," Natalie said softly, standing in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her. "You already are," Zachary assured her. "We will figure everything out together. No rush, remember?" She smiled at him with such trust that he made a silent vow to always be worthy of it. That night they lay together for the first time, and Zachary was gentle and patient, and Natalie clung to him with a mixture of nervousness and growing wonder. Afterward, she curled against his chest with her head on his shoulder, and Zachary held her close, stroking her hair until she fell asleep. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Natalie threw herself into making their house a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and a tablecloth for the kitchen table. She organized the pantry and learned how to use the cast iron stove. She tended the chickens Zachary bought for her and began planning the garden she would plant in the spring. Zachary worked from dawn until dusk with the cattle and horses, but he always came home for lunch, and every evening he made sure to spend time with Natalie, talking about their days and making plans for the future. He taught her to ride a gentle mare named Rosie so she could explore the ranch, and Natalie proved to be a natural horsewoman. Her stutter was less pronounced when she was relaxed, and at home with just Zachary, she often spoke in full sentences with only occasional hitches. One afternoon in October, Zachary came in from the range to find Natalie in the kitchen surrounded by jars of preserves. She had been to town that morning and bought fruit from a merchant, and now she was canning it for the winter. Look," she said proudly, gesturing to the rows of gleaming jars. "We will have peaches all winter." "You are amazing," Zachary said, meaning it. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and kissed the top of her head. "I am the luckiest man alive." She turned in his arms and kissed him properly, then pulled back with a shy smile. "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" he asked. "I think I might be with child," she said quietly. "It is too early to be certain, but I think so." Zachary stared at her for a moment, then let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "Are you sure?" he asked, setting her carefully on her feet. "And not see completely," she admitted. But I feel different, and I am late." "Then we will hope," Zachary said, placing his hand gently on her stomach. "And pray. And either way, I love you, Natalie Yates." It was the first time he had said it out loud, though he had felt it for weeks. Natalie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I'll love you too," she said. "So am much." They held each other in the kitchen surrounded by jars of peaches, and Zachary thought about how much his life had changed in just a few months. He had gone from being a lonely rancher to a husband, and possibly soon a father. All because a brave young woman with a stutter had been willing to take a chance on a stranger. Over the next weeks, it became clear that Natalie was indeed pregnant. She experienced morning sickness that left her pale and exhausted, and Zachary hovered anxiously, bringing her crackers and ginger tea, holding her hair back when she was sick. He hired a local woman, Maria, to come help with the heavy housework so Natalie could rest. Maria was a warm, motherly woman whose own children were grown. She and Natalie became fast friends despite the language barrier, communicating through gestures and broken English and Spanish. Maria taught Natalie to make tortillas and enchiladas, and Natalie taught Maria some Pennsylvania Dutch recipes she remembered from her childhood. As winter approached, mild though it was in Southern California, Zachary made sure the house was secure and well stocked. He bought extra blankets and food, wanting Natalie to have everything she might need. The baby would come in early summer, and he was already building a cradle in the barn during stolen moments. One December evening, they sat by the fire together with Natalie knitting a tiny blanket and Zachary reading aloud from a book of poetry they had borrowed from Mrs. Chen. The wind rattled the windows, but inside it was warm and cozy. "Do you think we will have a B boy or a G girl?" Natalie asked. "Does it matter?" Zachary replied. "And no," she said with a smile. "I just wonder." "I hope for a daughter who looks just like her mother," Zachary said, "pretty and brave and kind." "I hope for a son who is P patient and G good like his F father," Natalie countered. "Then we will be happy either way," Zachary concluded, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly at the ranch. Zachary had bought Natalie a beautiful shawl from the mercantile, and she had sewn him a new shirt with careful, tiny stitches. They attended Christmas services in town and shared dinner with Mrs. Chen and Maria and her family. A joyful gathering filled with laughter and multiple languages and good food. As 1883 began, Natalie's pregnancy became more obvious. Her dresses had to be let out, and Zachary loved watching her rest her hands on her growing belly. Sometimes in the evening he would put his hand there too and feel the baby move, tiny flutters that filled him with wonder. That is your pea, Papa," Natalie would tell her stomach. "He cannot wait to meet you." The ranch was doing well. Zachary had sold some cattle at good prices and had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, so he could spend more time close to the house as Natalie's pregnancy progressed. The men, brothers named Jack and Frank Miller, were hard-working and respectful, and they bunked in the barn. In March, a terrible storm rolled in from the ocean, bringing torrential rain and wind. It lasted 3 days, and on the second day, Jack came running to the house in the downpour. "Mr. Yates," he shouted. "Some of the cattle broke through the fence down in the south pasture. They are scattering." Zachary looked at Natalie, torn. She was 6 months pregnant now, and he hated to leave her. "Go," she said firmly. "I am fine, and Maria is coming tea today. Are you sure?" He asked. She nodded. "The cattle and need you. Will be fine." Reluctantly, Zachary pulled on his rain slicker and hat and headed out into the storm with Jack and Frank. They spent hours in the driving rain rounding up frightened cattle and repairing the damaged fence. By the time they finished, they were all soaked to the bone and exhausted. Zachary rode back to the house as darkness fell, worried about Natalie. He found her safe and warm in the kitchen with Maria, cooking supper as though nothing was wrong. She looked up when he entered, dripping water all over the floor. "Why you are soaked?" she scolded gently. "G go ch change before you see catch your D death." He obeyed, stripping off the wet clothes and changing into dry ones, then returning to the kitchen where hot food and his wife waited. As he ate, Natalie fussed over him, bringing him extra bread and making sure his coffee was hot. Maria watched with an approving smile. "She good wife," Maria said to Zachary in her halting English. "You lucky man." "I know it," Zachary agreed, smiling at Natalie. April brought wildflowers that carpeted the hills in brilliant colors, and Zachary took Natalie on slow rides around the ranch to see them. She was large with child now, moving carefully, but she refused to be confined to the house. They would pack a lunch and ride out to a pretty spot, spreading a blanket and eating while watching the horses graze nearby. "I see cannot be believe this is my life," Natalie said one afternoon, lying back on the blanket with her hands on her belly. Sometimes I think I might wake up and find it was all a doctor dream." "It is real," Zachary assured her, lying beside her and propping himself on one elbow. "You are real. This baby is real. Our life together is real." "IW was so scared when I got off that train," she admitted. "I thought UW would take one look at me and send me back." "Never," Zachary said fiercely. "You are everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I needed." She turned her head to look at him, and in her eyes he saw love so deep it took his breath away. He leaned over and kissed her gently, tasting strawberries from their lunch on her lips. May arrived hot and dry, and Natalie grew uncomfortable in the heat. Zachary rigged up a way to keep the house cool, hanging wet sheets in the windows to catch the breeze. He moved slowly with his work, always within shouting distance of the house, anxious as Natalie's time drew near. On a Tuesday morning in early June, Natalie woke with a gasp and clutched her belly. Zachary, who had been lying awake already, sat up immediately. "What is it?" he asked. "I think the baby is coming," she said, and there was fear in her voice but also excitement. Zachary leaped out of bed and pulled on his pants. "I will get Maria and the doctor." He rode to town faster than he had ever ridden before, first stopping at Maria's house to wake her, then racing to the doctor's home. Dr. Henderson, an elderly man who had delivered half the babies in San Diego, promised to come right away. By the time they all returned to the ranch, Natalie's labor was well established. Maria took charge, shooing Zachary out of the bedroom despite his protests. "Men no help," Maria said firmly. "You wait." So Zachary waited, pacing the front porch while inside his wife labored to bring their child into the world. He could hear her cries, could hear Maria's soothing voice and the doctor's calm instructions. Jack and Frank stayed at the barn, giving him space, but he was aware of their sympathetic presence. The sun climbed high in the sky and began its descent toward the ocean. Hours passed like years. Then, as the light turned golden with approaching evening, Zachary heard a new sound. A baby's cry, strong and indignant. He froze on the porch, barely breathing. The front door opened and Dr. Henderson appeared, wiping his hands on a towel. "Congratulations, Mr. Yates," he said with a smile. "You have a son. Both mother and baby are doing well." Zachary nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see them?" "Give Maria a few more minutes," the doctor advised. "But yes, soon." Those few minutes felt eternal, but finally Maria appeared at the door with a huge smile. "Come," she said. "Come meet your son." Zachary entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Natalie lay propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms she held a small bundle wrapped in the blanket she had knitted. As Zachary approached, she pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face with eyes squeezed shut and a shock of dark hair. "Here is your son," Natalie said softly. Isn't he beautiful? Zachary sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at his son, this miracle that had been created from love between him and his brave wife. Tears stung his eyes. "He is perfect," Zachary whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for this gift." She smiled tiredly. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months, going back and forth. Now, looking at his son, Zachary knew. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel James Yates." Samuel, Natalie repeated, testing it. "I'll love it." Dr. Henderson checked them both once more, declared everything as it should be, and prepared to leave. Zachary paid him and thanked him profusely. Maria stayed another hour to make sure Natalie was settled. Then she too departed with promises to return the next day. Finally, Zachary and Natalie were alone with their son. Samuel had nursed and fallen asleep, and now Zachary held him for the first time, marveling at how tiny and perfect he was. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a little nose, and rosebud lips. "We made this," Natalie said in wonder. "A whole person." "You made this," Zachary corrected. "You did all the hard work. I just got to enjoy the result." She laughed softly. "It takes two." Zachary carefully placed Samuel in the cradle beside their bed, the cradle he had built with his own hands. The baby slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled near his face. Zachary climbed into bed beside Natalie and held her close, being careful of her soreness. "I'll love you," she murmured, already half asleep from exhaustion. "I love you too," Zachary replied. "Both of you, my whole world." The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting. Samuel was a good baby but still needed constant care. He woke every few hours to nurse, and Natalie spent most of her time feeding him or sleeping. Zachary took over all the household chores, cooking and cleaning while also managing the ranch. Maria came daily to help, and Zachary was grateful for her presence. Slowly, life found a new rhythm. Samuel grew and began to spend more time awake, his dark eyes taking in the world around him. Zachary would hold him in the evenings, talking to him about the ranch and the cattle and all the things they would do together when he was older. "You will learn to ride," Zachary told his son, "and rope cattle, and mend fences. But first, you will learn to be kind and honest and patient, like your mother." Natalie would smile from her chair, knitting or sewing, listening to Zachary talk to their baby. Her stutter had lessened considerably since the birth, perhaps because she was so focused on Samuel that she forgot to be self-conscious. Or perhaps it was because she was completely relaxed and happy in her life. By the time Samuel was 3 months old, Natalie had recovered her strength and returned to her normal activities. She wore the baby in a sling while she worked around the house and garden, and Samuel seemed content to watch everything from his perch against her chest. One Sunday in September, exactly a year after Natalie had arrived on that train, they went to church as a family. People gathered around to admire Samuel, and Natalie glowed with pride as she accepted their compliments and congratulations. Afterward, Mrs. Chen invited them to dinner at the boarding house, and they sat around her table with Maria and her family and Jack and Frank, a strange extended family bound not by blood but by affection and shared experiences. "To family," Mrs. Chen said, raising her glass. "However we find it." "To family," they all echoed. That night, lying in bed with Samuel asleep in his cradle and Natalie curled against his side, Zachary reflected on the past year. It had been a journey he never could have imagined. When he had sent those letters to the matrimonial agency, he had been hoping for a companion, someone to share his life and help with the ranch. What he had gotten instead was love, real and deep and transformative. He had gotten Natalie, with her gentle spirit and her stutter and her brave heart. He had gotten Samuel, this perfect little person who depended on them completely. He had gotten a real family. "What are you thinking about?" Natalie murmured sleepily. "Just how lucky I am," Zachary replied. "How grateful. And me too," she said. "IW was so lonely before. And now I have everything." "You will always have me," Zachary promised. "And Samuel, we are yours forever." She snuggled closer, and Zachary wrapped his arm around her, holding his whole world in that embrace. The years that followed were full and good. Samuel grew into a sturdy toddler with his mother's eyes and his father's determination. He took his first steps in the kitchen while Natalie was baking bread, walking straight into her arms while she laughed and cried at the same time. He said his first word, which was "Mama," much to Zachary's mock dismay. "What about Papa?" Zachary had asked, pretending to be hurt. Samuel had just grinned at him and said "Mama" again. The ranch prospered. Zachary expanded his herd and bought more land. He built a new barn and a bunkhouse for the hands who worked for him. Jack and Frank stayed on, becoming trusted friends as well as employees. Other men came and went, drifting with the seasons, but the ranch became known as a good place to work, where the boss was fair, and the food was excellent thanks to Natalie's cooking. When Samuel was 2, Natalie became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. She continued her work around the house and garden, only slowing down in the final weeks. Their second son was born in the spring of 1885, another healthy boy with a lusty cry. They named him Matthew Thomas Yates, and Samuel was fascinated by his baby brother. He would stand by the cradle and touch Matthew's tiny hands gently, crooning nonsense words that made Natalie and Zachary smile. "Gee, gentle," Natalie would remind him. "He is very small." "My baby," Samuel would announce proudly to anyone who would listen. With 2 small children, life became even busier. Natalie sometimes looked exhausted by evening, but she was happy. Zachary made sure to give her time to rest, taking the boys out to the barn to see the horses or sitting with them while she took a nap. He was an involved father, changing diapers and soothing tears and telling bedtime stories. One evening when Matthew was 6 months old and Samuel was nearing 3, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Samuel played with his wooden horses while Matthew dozed in Natalie's arms. Zachary sat beside his wife with his arm around her shoulders. "Did you ever regret it?" Natalie asked softly. "Am marrying a male order bride?" Zachary turned to look at her in surprise. "Never. Not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" she shrugged, not meeting his eyes. Sometimes I wonder if you wish you had married someone who could talk properly." "Natalie Yates, you look at me," Zachary commanded gently. When she did, he continued. "You talk perfectly fine. And even if you did not, even if you never said another word, I would still love you with everything I am. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, you and these boys. Do not ever doubt that." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I'll love you so much." "I love you too," he said, kissing her softly. "Always will." Samuel looked up from his toys. "Mama crying, happy tears," Natalie assured him. "Mama is just very happy." "Good," Samuel said, satisfied, and went back to his horses. Time moved on in the way it does, simultaneously crawling and flying. Samuel started attending the schoolhouse in town, riding in with Zachary a few days a week. He was a bright child, eager to learn, though he struggled a bit with reading at first. Natalie worked with him patiently every evening, and slowly he improved. Matthew grew into a cheerful, rambunctious toddler who was always getting into mischief. Where Samuel was thoughtful and cautious, Matthew was impulsive and fearless. Zachary joked that they would need to build a bigger bunkhouse just to keep Matthew contained. In 1887, when Samuel was 5 and Matthew was 2, Natalie had a third pregnancy. This one was difficult from the start. She was sick constantly and exhausted. Dr. Henderson, older now but still practicing, was concerned. "You need to rest, Mrs. Yates," he instructed. "Complete bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy." Natalie protested, but Zachary was firm. He hired additional help, bringing in a young woman named Sarah to care for the boys and help with the house. Maria came daily as well, and together they took over all of Natalie's duties. For 4 months, Natalie stayed in bed, frustrated and worried but obedient. Zachary spent every free moment with her, bringing her meals, reading to her, keeping her company. Samuel and Matthew would visit their mother, careful to be gentle, bringing her flowers from the garden and pictures they had drawn. In November, Natalie went into labor 3 weeks early. It was long and difficult, and Zachary paced the porch again, this time with 2 small boys clinging to his legs. "Mama be okay?" Samuel asked anxiously. "Mama will be fine," Zachary assured him, praying he was right. "She is very strong." When Dr. Henderson finally emerged, he looked tired but pleased. "Another boy, Mr. Yates, small but healthy, and your wife came through like a champion." The relief was so intense that Zachary had to sit down. Samuel and Matthew immediately began jumping around with excitement. "Another brother," Matthew crowed. They named him Daniel Robert Yates, and he was indeed small, barely 6 pounds. But he was fierce and determined, nursing strongly right from the start. Natalie recovered slowly from the difficult pregnancy and birth, but with rest and good care, she regained her health. By the time Daniel was 6 months old, the ranch house rang with the sounds of 3 boys playing and arguing and laughing. It was chaos sometimes, but it was the joyful chaos of a life well lived. One evening in the summer of 1888, Zachary sat on the porch with Natalie after the boys were finally asleep. They were both exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion. "6 years," Natalie said. "Has it really been 6 years since I got off that train?" "6 years," Zachary confirmed. "Best 6 years of my life." "Mine too," she agreed. She looked out at the ranch, at the land they had built their life on, at the home they had created together. "I was so scared that day. Afraid UW would reject me, afraid IW would fail, afraid of everything." "You were the bravest person I had ever met," Zachary said. "You still are. You crossed the country alone to marry a stranger. You built a home in a wild land. You gave me 3 beautiful sons. There is nothing you cannot do." "We did it together," she corrected. "I could never have done any of it without you. Your patience, your kindness." "Partners," Zachary said, taking her hand. "That is what we are, partners in all things." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. From inside the house came a small cry, probably Daniel waking. Natalie started to rise, but Zachary stopped her. "I will get him," he said. "You rest." He went inside and picked up his youngest son, changing his diaper and soothing him back to sleep. When he returned to the porch, Natalie had fallen asleep in her chair, her head tilted back and her face peaceful. Zachary smiled and gently woke her to guide her to bed. As the boys grew older, the ranch became their playground and classroom. Zachary taught them to ride, to care for animals, to mend fences and herd cattle. Samuel took to it naturally, patient and careful with the livestock. Matthew was more interested in the horses, spending hours in the barn talking to them and brushing them until their coats gleamed. Daniel, the youngest, was still too small for much ranch work, but he followed his brothers everywhere, determined not to be left behind. Natalie educated them at home when they were not in school, teaching them mathematics and history and literature. She read to them every night, her stutter barely noticeable now except when she was very tired or stressed. The boys never seemed to notice it at all. It was just part of Mama, like her gentle voice and soft hands and the way she always smelled of bread and lavender. In 1890, tragedy struck the community. A fire swept through part of San Diego, destroying several businesses including the general store and the church. No one was killed, but many people lost everything. Zachary and Natalie immediately opened their home and ranch to those who needed help. 3 families stayed in the bunkhouse and barn until they could rebuild, and Natalie organized the women to cook meals and care for children while the men worked on reconstruction. Mrs. Chen's boarding house survived the fire, and she too took in displaced families. Maria's family opened their home as well. The community came together in a way that made Zachary proud to be part of it. Within 3 months, new buildings stood where the old ones had burned, and people began to return to normal life. The experience brought the community closer. Friendships deepened, and networks of support strengthened. Zachary served on the town council for a term, helping to plan better fire prevention measures. Natalie joined a women's group that met weekly to sew and socialize, and she slowly came out of her shell, making friends among the other ranchers' wives. One afternoon, Zachary came home from town to find Natalie in tears at the kitchen table. Alarmed, he rushed to her side. "What happened?" "Are the boys all right?" "They are fine," she managed through her tears. "I just got a letter from Pennsylvania." Zachary's stomach tightened. Letters from back east usually meant bad news. "What does it say?" My Aunt P passed away," Natalie said. "Last month. They just now told me." He pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried. The aunt who had taken her in after her father died, who had been kind despite having no room or money to spare. It was the last connection to Natalie's old life. "I should have gone back to visit," Natalie sobbed. "I should have written more." "You wrote every month," Zachary reminded her gently, "and sent money when we could spare it. You did what you could. She knew you loved her." "I hope so," Natalie said. They held a small memorial service at their ranch, with the boys and some close friends attending. Natalie said a few words about her aunt, stumbling over them but speaking from the heart. Afterward, she seemed more settled, as though saying goodbye properly had given her peace. Life continued its steady march forward. Samuel grew tall and serious, taking on more responsibility around the ranch. By the time he was 10, he could rope and brand cattle as well as any of the hands. Matthew remained obsessed with horses and showed a natural talent for training them. He could gentle even the wildest Mustang, working with patience and kindness. Daniel, at 5 years old, was the family comedian, always making them laugh with his antics and observations. In 1892, Natalie discovered she was pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. She was 31 now, and they had thought their family was complete. But this pregnancy was easy, like her second had been, and she sailed through it with minimal problems. In the spring of 1893, Natalie gave birth to their only daughter. She was tiny and perfect, with a full head of dark hair and her father's chin. They named her Rose Elizabeth Yates, and she was immediately adored by her 3 older brothers. "Our sister," Samuel said solemnly, holding her carefully while sitting on the sofa with pillows all around him. "We have to protect her always." "Always," Matthew and Daniel echoed. Zachary watched his 4 children together and felt his heart might burst from happiness. He looked at Natalie, tired but glowing, and mouthed, "I love you," across the room. She smiled back, her eyes full of the same joy he felt. Rose grew into a bright, determined little girl who had her mother's gentle nature and her father's stubborn streak. Her brothers doted on her, teaching her to ride and protecting her fiercely from any perceived threats. Natalie dressed her in pretty dresses and put ribbons in her hair, delighting in having a daughter after 3 sons. The ranch continued to prosper. Zachary was now one of the most successful ranchers in the area, with hundreds of head of cattle and a thriving horse breeding operation thanks to Matthew's skill. He employed a dozen men full-time and more during busy seasons. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, and it was a far cry from the modest cabin Natalie had first come to. But despite the prosperity, they remained humble and generous. Zachary and Natalie never forgot their own beginnings, the faith it had taken to build their life together. They helped others when they could, hiring men who were down on their luck and paying fair wages. Natalie always had food for those who were hungry and old clothes cleaned and mended for those who needed them. As the children grew, the house remained full of life and love. There were arguments and tears, of course, as there are in any family. But there was also laughter and music and storytelling around the dinner table. Zachary would tell tales of his early days in California, and Natalie would share memories of Pennsylvania. The children would listen wide-eyed, unable to imagine their parents as young and uncertain. One evening when Rose was 3 and Samuel was nearly 16, the family gathered on the porch after supper as they often did. The boys were discussing ranch business with Zachary while Natalie and Rose looked at the stars. "Mama, tell about when you met Papa," Rose demanded, as she often did. She never tired of the story. Natalie smiled. "Well, I see came on a train all the way from Pennsylvania, because you were going to be a mail-order bride," Rose said, knowing the story by heart. "That is right," Natalie agreed. "And I was very scared because I had never met your father before." "But then you saw him and fell in love," Rose prompted. "Not right away," Natalie laughed. "But he was very kind to me, even though I could not talk right." Samuel looked up from his conversation with Zachary. "You talk fine, Mama." Thank you, sweetheart," Natalie said. "But I stutter sometimes. When I first met your father it was much worse. I was so nervous." "What did Papa say?" Rose asked, even though she knew. "He said, 'Take your time, I love hearing your voice always,'" Natalie quoted, looking over at Zachary with such love in her eyes that even the children noticed. "That is because Mama has the best voice," Zachary said firmly. "Always have thought so, always will." Rose scrambled off her mother's lap and climbed into Zachary's. "And then what happened?" "Then we fell in love," Zachary said, kissing the top of her head, "and got married, and built this ranch, and had you 4 wonderful, exhausting children." "Hey," Matthew protested, but he was grinning. "Best decision I ever made," Zachary continued. "Asking your mama to marry me." "Second best," Natalie corrected. "First best was getting on that train in the first place." They smiled at each other across the porch, a lifetime of love and partnership in that glance. The children watched, absorbing this example of what marriage could be, what it should be. As the years passed, the children grew into adults. Samuel took over more and more of the ranch operations, showing a keen business sense to go along with his ranching skills. He courted and married the school teacher, a smart young woman named Anne who fit right into the family. They built a house on the far end of the ranch property and started their own family. Matthew opened a horse training business in addition to his work on the ranch. People came from all over California to buy horses trained by Matthew Yates, known for his patience and skill. He married a rancher's daughter from the next county, and they settled near the ranch as well. Daniel, the family comedian, surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher. He moved to San Francisco to attend college, but he came home every summer and for holidays, filling the house with his laughter and stories of city life. Rose, the baby of the family, grew into a beautiful and intelligent young woman. She had inherited her mother's kindness and her father's determination, and everyone who met her loved her. She had plans to become a nurse, wanting to help people the way Dr. Henderson had helped her family over the years. In 1905, Zachary and Natalie celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary. They were in their mid-50s now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but they were still deeply in love. They sat on the porch of their home, the same porch where they had spent countless evenings over the years, and looked out at the ranch that had been built from love and hard work. "TW 22 years, Natalie said softly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday I got off that train. "Best day of my life," Zachary said, taking her hand. Their fingers intertwined automatically, a gesture so familiar it required no thought. "I was terrified," Natalie admitted. "Sure UW would send me back once you heard me talk." "I fell in love with you the moment I saw you," Zachary confessed. "Standing there so brave and scared at the same time, clutching that carpet bag. And then when you spoke, when I heard your voice, I just fell deeper." "UN never made me feel broken," Natalie said, tears in her eyes now. "You always made me feel valued." "Because you are valuable," Zachary said. "You are the heart of this family, the heart of me. Everything good in my life comes from you." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. From inside the house came the sound of their grandchildren playing. Samuel and Anne had 3 children now, and they visited often. "We have been blessed," Natalie said. "Beyond measure," Zachary agreed. They had built a good life together, this patient cowboy and his mail-order bride with a stutter. They had created a family, a legacy, a love that would echo through generations. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story of how they met, of Zachary's kindness and Natalie's courage, and they would know that true love exists, that patience and understanding can overcome any obstacle, that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on a stranger. As night fell and the stars emerged one by one, Zachary and Natalie remained on the porch, hands clasped, hearts entwined. Behind them, the house they had built together was full of light and laughter. Before them, the ranch they had nurtured stretched into the darkness. And between them, the love that had sustained them for 22 years burned as bright as ever. "I'll love you," Natalie whispered. "I love you too," Zachary replied. "Take your time, I love hearing your voice always." She smiled, remembering those words from so long ago, the words that had changed her life. They were still true, would always be true. In Zachary's patient love, Natalie had found her home, and in Natalie's brave heart, Zachary had found his purpose. The years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Samuel and Anne welcomed their 4th child, a daughter they named after Natalie. Matthew and his wife had twin boys who were as wild and rambunctious as their father had been. Daniel returned from San Francisco with a wife, a fellow teacher named Grace, and they settled in San Diego, where he taught at the expanded school. Rose completed her nursing training and began working at the new hospital in town, earning a reputation for her skilled and compassionate care. Zachary officially retired from active ranch management in 1908, handing the reins over to Samuel. But retirement for Zachary meant supervising rather than working, and he could still be found most days riding the property on his old horse, checking fences and cattle more out of habit than necessity. Natalie, now in her late 50s, spent her days tending her large garden, preserving food, and being the matriarch of their ever-expanding family. They had 11 grandchildren by 1910, with more on the way. The ranch house had become the gathering place for the entire family, especially on Sundays and holidays. Natalie would cook huge meals, aided by her daughters-in-law and Rose, and the table would be crowded with multiple generations all talking and laughing at once. During these gatherings, the grandchildren would beg for stories, and Zachary would tell them about the early days of the ranch, about cattle drives and wild horses, and building a life from nothing. But their favorite story was always how Grandma and Grandpa met. "Tell about the train station," the children would beg, and Zachary would tell the story of seeing Natalie for the first time, so brave and scared. He would tell about her stutter, which she still had, though it was much less pronounced now. He would tell about falling in love with a woman who thought she was broken but who was actually perfect. "What did you say when Grandma could not talk right?" one of the grandchildren asked. "I said, 'Take your time, I love hearing your voice always,'" Zachary replied, looking at Natalie across the room where she sat with the youngest grandchild on her lap. "And I meant every word." The children would sigh happily, storing the story away to tell their own children someday. In 1912, tragedy struck when Matthew was killed in a horse accident. A stallion he was training spooked and threw him, and he hit his head on a fence post. He died instantly, leaving behind his wife and 4 children. The family was devastated. Zachary and Natalie helped Matthew's widow through those dark days, taking care of the children and managing the horse training business, until she could decide what to do. The funeral was the largest San Diego had ever seen, with people coming from all over to pay their respects to the man who had trained their horses and been their friend. Natalie took it especially hard. Matthew had been her second son, her wild child who made her laugh. She cried for weeks, and her stutter worsened with the stress. But Zachary was there, patient as always, holding her while she grieved and listening when she needed to talk. "Life is so fragile," she said one night as they lay in bed. "One moment he was here and then he was gone." "I know," Zachary said, his own grief heavy in his chest. "But he lived well, Natalie. He was happy. He had a family he loved and work that brought him joy. We gave him a good life." "I wish I could have given him more tea time," she said. "We do not get to choose that," Zachary reminded her gently. "We only get to choose how we live the time we have." Matthew lived his fully. Slowly, the family healed from the loss. Matthew's wife eventually remarried, a kind man who loved her children as his own. The horse training business was sold, though the new owner kept Matthew's name on it, honoring his legacy. Life continued. Rose married a doctor she met at the hospital, and they opened a practice together in San Diego. Daniel and Grace had 3 children and continued teaching, shaping young minds and building the future. Samuel ran the ranch with skill and dedication, expanding it even further than his father had. In 1915, Zachary and Natalie celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a huge party at the ranch. All their children, grandchildren, and many friends came to celebrate with them. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Speeches were made, toasting the couple who had built such a strong foundation of love. When it was Zachary's turn to speak, he stood with Natalie at his side and looked out at the gathered crowd. His family, his legacy, his life's work. 30 years ago, he said, his voice strong despite his 65 years. I stood on a train platform waiting for a woman I had never met. I was nervous and excited and had no idea what to expect. Then Natalie stepped off that train and my life began. Not the life I had before, which was just existing, but real life. Life with purpose and meaning and love. She gave me 4 beautiful children. She gave me a home, not just a house, but a real home filled with laughter and warmth. She gave me everything that matters. He turned to look at Natalie, who was crying happy tears. You are still the bravest person I know. You are still beautiful inside and out. And I still love hearing your voice every single day. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy 30 years ago. The crowd applauded and wiped away their own tears. Natalie stood and hugged Zachary tight, and everyone could see the love that still burned bright between them. Thank you, Natalie managed to say into the microphone when Zachary had sat down. For W waiting for me to find my words. For L loving me exactly as I am. UG gave me a life I never dreamed was possible. I'll love you more than W words can say. More applause, more tears. The party continued late into the night with music and stories and laughter. As Zachary and Natalie slow danced under the stars, surrounded by the family they had created, they both thought about how far they had come from that day on the train platform. Would you do it again? Natalie asked. If you could go back, would you still choose me? In a heartbeat, Zachary said without hesitation. I would choose you in every lifetime, in every version of reality. You are my person, Natalie. Always have been, always will be. She smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. Me too. I would choose you every time. They danced on, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Zachary and Natalie were in their 70s now, slowing down but still active. They spent their days in peaceful routine, tending the garden, visiting with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching the sunset. Samuel ran the ranch successfully, making them proud. Daniel had become principal of the San Diego school system. Rose and her husband had opened a second medical practice. The legacy they had built continued to grow and flourish. In the spring of 1920, Zachary became ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, then became difficulty breathing. Dr. Henderson had long since passed, but Rose and her husband cared for Zachary with skill and devotion. They diagnosed pneumonia and did everything they could, but Zachary was 70 years old and his body was tired. Natalie never left his side. She sat by his bed day and night, holding his hand and talking to him softly. Sometimes she read to him from his favorite books. Sometimes she just told him stories of their life together, reminding him of all the good times they had shared. Do you remember the day we met? She asked one evening as the sun set outside the window. Zachary, weak but still aware, smiled. Best day of my life, he whispered. You were so handsome, Natalie said. Standing there with your hat in your hands, I thought maybe you would not want me when you heard me talk. I loved your voice from the first word, Zachary said. Still do. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch, knowing the end was near. On a Tuesday morning in May, with Natalie holding his hand and all his children around the bed, Zachary Yates took his last breath. He died as he had lived, surrounded by love. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Zachary had been respected throughout the region as a fair rancher, a good neighbor, and a devoted family man. But the most touching tribute came from Natalie, who stood at the front of the church and spoke clearly, her stutter barely noticeable through her grief. My husband was the kindest man I ever knew, she said. He saw in me, not my stutter. He loved me, not despite my flaws but including them. He gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams, and I was lucky enough to love him for 37 years. Will miss him every day for the rest of my life. But I am grateful for the time we had. Grateful for the family we be built. Grateful for a love that will last beyond death. She sat down, and Samuel put his arm around her. The family grieved together, supporting each other as Zachary would have wanted. Natalie lived another 8 years without her husband. They were long, lonely years in many ways, though she was surrounded by family. She moved into a smaller house in town, closer to Rose and Daniel, though she visited the ranch often. The house where she and Zachary had raised their children, the porch where they had sat countless evenings, all held precious memories. She watched her great-grandchildren grow and welcomed more into the family. She taught the young girls to sew and cook and garden. She told stories about Grandpa Zachary to anyone who would listen. She kept his memory alive through her words and her love. In the summer of 1928, Natalie became ill. Her heart, the doctors said, was simply worn out. She was 70 years old and had lived a full, rich life. Her children gathered around her bed, just as they had gathered around their father's. On her last day, Rose sat beside her holding her hand. "Mama, what do you want me to tell people about you?" she asked. Natalie smiled weakly. Tell them I was brave enough to take a chance. Tell them I found love in the most unexpected place. And tell them that every since Stutter, every stammering word was worth it because your father loved hearing my voice." She closed her eyes then, peaceful and ready. An hour later, with all her children around her, Natalie Owens Yates passed away quietly. Her last word was Zachary, whispered with love. They buried her next to her husband in the cemetery overlooking the ranch. The stone was simple, bearing both their names and a single phrase beneath. "Take your time. I love hearing your voice always." The legacy of Zachary and Natalie Yates lived on through their descendants. The ranch continued to operate, passed down through the family. The stories of how they met, of his patience and her courage, became family legend told at every gathering. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually walk that land, tend those cattle, and sit on that porch, never knowing the two people who started it all but benefiting from the love they shared. In San Diego, a wing of the hospital was named after Rose Yates and her husband, and a school bore Daniel Yates's name. The horse training facility that Matthew had started, though sold, still carried his legacy. And Samuel's descendants continued to ranch the land that Zachary and Natalie had built together. Their love story became a cherished part of family history, passed down through generations. The tale of the mail-order bride with a stutter and the patient cowboy who loved her voice. It was a story about taking chances, about looking beyond surface imperfections to see the person beneath. It was a story about building a life together through hard work and dedication. But most of all, it was a story about love, real and deep and lasting. Years after both of them had passed, a great-great-granddaughter would find the old letters in a trunk in the ranch house attic. Natalie's carefully written letters from Pennsylvania, each one taking hours to compose to hide her stutter. Zachary's responses, kind and encouraging, telling her about California and his dreams for the future. And later letters after they married, written when one or the other was traveling, full of love and longing and everyday details that showed a life well lived together. The great-great-granddaughter, a writer, would eventually pen a book about Zachary and Natalie, sharing their story with the world. It would become a bestseller, touching hearts across the country. People would write to say how the story had inspired them to look past surface differences, to be more patient with loved ones, to take chances on love. But the real legacy of Zachary and Natalie Yates was not in any book or memorial. It was in the family they had created, the values they had instilled, and the example of love they had set. It was in every great-grandchild who learned patience by hearing about their great-great-grandfather. It was in every descendant who found courage by learning about their great-great-grandmother who traveled across the country alone to marry a stranger. Their story lived on because love like theirs does not fade. It echoes through time, touching lives and changing futures. Zachary and Natalie had started with nothing but hope and a willingness to try. They had built an empire of love, and that empire would stand long after they were gone. On the ranch, the house still stood strong, expanded and modernized but still recognizable. The porch where they had sat so many evenings was still there, though the wood had been replaced several times. New generations sat there now, watching their own sunsets, making their own memories. But somehow, if you sat very still and listened carefully, you could almost hear echoes of an old conversation. A soft voice, stuttering slightly, telling stories, and a deeper voice responding with infinite patience. "Take your time, I love hearing your voice always." And in that echo lived the truth of Zachary and Natalie Yates. That love is patient, that everyone deserves to be heard, to be valued, to be cherished exactly as they are. That sometimes the best things in life require taking a leap of faith, and that true love, once found, lasts forever. Their story ended as all stories must, with death and grief. But it also ended with hope, with legacy, with the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. They had been happy. They had built something that mattered. They had changed each other and everyone who came after them for the better. In the end, that is all any love story can hope to be. A testament to the power of connection, of patience, of seeing another person truly and loving what you see. Zachary and Natalie Yates had that, and in having it, they had everything that mattered. The sun set over the California ranch one more time, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The cattle lowed in the distance. Horses whinnied in the barn. And in the old cemetery on the hill, two headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of a patient cowboy and his mail-order bride. They had found each other against all odds. They had built a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. And their story, told and retold through generations, would live on forever as a reminder of what love truly is: patient, kind, and enduring. Always worth the wait, always worth the risk, always worth every stammered word and patient response. This was the legacy of Zachary and Natalie Yates. And it was beautiful.